The Lord be with you. My God, we thank you for this day when we can begin a new study on the book of Daniel. We pray that you would help us learn and experience what it means to have integrity, particularly in those places where it looks like you aren't there. Amen.
Amen.
I'm excited for us to go through our book of Daniel. And as I thought about it while I made this presentation, it occurred to me that apparently Daniel is one of the books I am most familiar with in the Old Testament, but I haven't thought about it in a long time. So it brought up some really good memories. Before we walk away from Revelation, did anyone miss their certificates? Oh, look, hey, I see 3 hands, and I have 3 right here. Did you get this one?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
Thank you.
So this is your very own Revelation certificate. My always encouragement is hang it up like with a window facing your neighbor. They can ask you about it. You go, oh, it's about Revelation. Let me tell you about it. And now you'll be able to do that about the book of Daniel. I showed you this graphic last week. Here is the book of Daniel, which we're going to be going through today. There is a handout if everyone got one. The very first paragraph is kind of my summary about the details of Daniel, how it was put together. We will explain that together for like 15 minutes in a few slides. The second paragraph is about chapter 1 and chapter 2, and then there's the outline. And like always, there's fun facts on the back, as well as our schedule. The lens through which I will be looking at Daniel is integrity in the empire. And so if you want to tell people what study you're doing, you go, oh, we're doing the book of Daniel about having integrity in the empire. And I hope you keep remembering this word. The other thing to just know about Daniel, and I make note of this in the summary paragraph, the book of Daniel has 2 main sections. There's chapters 1 through 6 and chapters 7 through 12. Chapters 1 through 6 are the court stories. If you read a commentary or you're looking at an outline, they'll probably say court tales, court stories, or something. I'm calling that part stories of resistance. The second part is the apocalyptic part, which I know all of you will love. We will go through that part kind of quickly, but that is the visions of hope. And that's the apocalyptic part, in particular, chapter 7 of Daniel and chapter 10 of Daniel deal with that the most, in the sense of what we will be familiar with from the book of Revelation. It quotes a lot of Daniel 7, a lot of Daniel 10. Okay. Also, I made this picture, or AI made that picture, which I don't usually use AI to make pictures, but I wanted one that was in this style, but that combines 2 big stories from Daniel that for me are the main stories of resistance. One of them is when Daniel's in the lion's den, and there's also this scene before that where Daniel is praying 3 times a day out in front of everyone. And I could not find a picture that had both him praying and the lion's den. So, woohoo. Okay. This is our schedule for this book. Today, we'll do an overview of Daniel, and we will also talk about chapters 1 and 2. Next week, we will talk about chapters 3 through 6. That means this week and next week, we will be done with the first half of Daniel. The following week, we will do chapter 7 and 8. That will begin to get into some of the apocalypse. And then the really intense apocalypse part is chapters 9 through 12. So we're going to go through it very, very quickly. We will also talk that last week about some Greek additions to Daniel. I'll talk about that in a moment when we get there on our slide. After June 5th, we are going to take a break. We will take a break for the rest of June, and we will come back on July 3rd. On July 3rd, we will do a special topic, and then we will start a new book. We're going to do a special topic on July 3rd, just in case anyone is gone for July 4th weekend, so you won't miss the next book that we do. Okay, before we kind of break down the book, I think there's more handouts over this way. I had a question. Miss Rachel had a question. If anyone would be able to help in VBS to cook dinner, I think you all made food last week. Or last year. Did anyone else?
We did the breakfast.
You did the breakfast night? Okay. So some people from our class have helped last year. I think that was the first year Rachel asked us. But what Rachel said is it's food for about 75 people. That is some adults. It's mainly kids. And like nuggets or any other snack food are easy. Apparently we did a breakfast for dinner last year. And Rachel asked that you would pick up food and help serve the food and then clean up after dinner time. But if she said the VBS can pay for the food if you turn in the receipt. If you, yeah?
I have a question.
Okay.
I know that Ascension is moving into Safe Church. Do you have to be certified under Safe Church to participate in?
Not for this, I don't
Teaching?
think, because
Yes.
you're just cooking food.
Would you check on that?
I will, and because I'm on a camera, I'll say we will double check on that. We will make sure everyone is safe. If you might be interested, let me know after class or shoot me an email. I'll include this in the email as well. Rachel said no one has claimed a night yet. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday are all open. Okay, last thing I was going to say, these are the 3 books I kind of recommend for Daniel. I went over these last week. The first is this book. It's part of the Tyndale Old Testament commentary. If you're looking for a really great all-rounder traditional commentary on Daniel, I would recommend that book. If you want like a step up and you're really cool and you want to look at it through some of the lens I'll be using, I'd recommend this book, Daniel, A Theological Introduction. It's part of the African American New Testament commentary, and it kind of leans into a type of theology called liberation theology, which is how do we as oppressed people live in oppressed places. That's a lot of the perspectives I'll be taking for Daniel. And if you're just really weird and you already bought those 2, and you wanted to be even weirder, I would recommend this other one from the Old Testament Library by Carol Newsom. I'll just say that book is intense to read. I got a little overwhelmed when I was looking at the previews for that book. Okay, Daniel. The book of Daniel is about integrity in the empire, and we are going to begin to break that down. Here's our summary sheet for Daniel, which is about integrity in the empire. There's stories of resistance, there's visions of hope. Again, the stories of resistance are these court tales. The visions of hope are the apocalyptic part. Daniel kind of looking forward. It's the unveiling of history, of what God's doing in the world. This is a 2nd century BCE writing. So, and when I say BCE, it's the same thing as BC. And it's what makes Daniel weird or unique. It's the only book in the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible that has large portions of Aramaic. There are some other small portions of Aramaic, maybe a chapter here or there, like in the book of Ezekiel. But no other book is like half of another language. And so the book of Daniel starts off, chapter 1's in Hebrew, chapters 2 through 7 are Aramaic, and then, or 2 through, I think it's 2 through 7, yeah, and then 8 through 12 go back to Hebrew. And then what gets even weirder is there's all these other additions to Daniel, which we'll talk about, that are in Greek. So it makes it an interesting book, the way it's laid out. We'll talk about how that developed in a moment, but just one thing to know when you read it, chapter 1's in Hebrew, 2 through 7 is in Aramaic, and 8 through 12 is also in Hebrew.
And then
Yeah.
isn't there like more Daniel, in the Apocrypha?
So that's the Greek editions.
The Greek part.
Yes, yeah. There are 2 sections that typically get added at the end of chapter 3. It's the prayer of Azariah, which is one of Daniel's friends, or the prayer of 3 Jews. And then there's I forget what the other part's called, actually. Then there's an extra chapter 13 and an extra chapter 14, which is called Suzanne and Bel and the Dragon. And Bel and the Dragon is my favorite kind of ending to Daniel. So I'm excited when we get there. It's a lot of fun. We're going to talk about a map and some history. Because just like Revelation, where history was really important to understand how the book came to be, Daniel's the same way. So in Israel's history, so Israel's down here, or Judah, Babylon comes in and conquers them in about 597 BCE. The time period for Daniel is set here, but Daniel is not written until way later. It's one of the last books to be completed. It was probably done during sometime during the Seleucid Empire. I'll talk about that in a minute. In particular, when this guy was king named Antiochus IV, and it was the beginning of kind of the Maccabean revolt, and sort of the way that the history happened. So Babylon comes in and conquers Judah. They carry off people from Jerusalem and take them back into Babylon. Way over here, there was two other empires. There was the Median Empire, or the Medes, and the Persians. Cyrus the Great, you might remember him from history, he conquers the Medes, and the Median-Persian Empire ends up conquering Babylon, and Cyrus becomes the new king over Judah because they take over all of this. And the story of Daniel spans all of that. And it ends like when Cyrus helps resettle Jerusalem. People go back, they rebuild the temple, rebuild the city. The book of Nehemiah and the book of Ezra talk about that part coming back with Cyrus. And so the book of Daniel spans that whole time. It's the whole period of the exile. And the exile lasted for 70 years. And so in the story, Daniel's like a young teen. He grows up, becomes an old man, and he serves in the court of Babylon and then later of Persia. Okay, that was fun history, right? Something else happens, though, and I'm going to show you another map because here's ancient Israel. They get conquered by Babylon. Then the Persians come through. And then the Persians didn't last forever because Alexander the Great came and messed up the whole world. And when Alexander the Great, we'll show another map that shows his kingdom, but he conquered pretty much everything that was known. So he took Babylon and Persia all the way to the edge of Asia, but he took it even farther and came down and conquered Egypt, which you might remember from history. And that becomes relevant in a moment. What happens after the Alexander the Great dies is that his kingdom is divided essentially into four big sections, but we only care about two of them. And it's the Ptolemies, which is in Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire, which is what comes to reign over Judah. You don't have to remember this. There won't be a test. And then the Seleucids are reigning over Israel or of Judah and Jerusalem. They end up, when Antiochus IV is the king, he comes in and he messes up the temple and puts like pagan items there. And those who are faithful Jews freak out and they get upset. And there's this Maccabean revolt that leads to the Hasmonean dynasty when Israel is kind of independent. That was a lot of history. This is why I want to tell it to you. The scene for Daniel is all taking place from like all of Babylon and the beginning of Persia. But it's not written until Persia and the very early Hellenistic Empire. This is when those court tales get compiled together. And then the second part of Daniel, when it gets finished and kind of goes through some of its last revisions. And when we look at the text, scholars will note that this is a very heavily edited book. There are lots of added sentences. There are corrections to timelines that are all in the book. So it's a book that went through a lot of phases, but it doesn't get finished until right before that kind of Maccabean revolt. But then it still wasn't done because they kept adding Greek parts. And the reason for that is because a lot of Jews ended up in Egypt where the Ptolemies were. And so they wrote Greek editions where they spoke a lot of Greek there. And it was more contextual to their experiences in Egypt. Whew, okay. Any questions on that? That was a lot of history. Y'all just look scared. Okay, I wanted to show you this map because this is leading to why Daniel gets written in the way that we have it. So this is right before Daniel. All this red is where Alexander the Great conquered. So this used to be Persia and stuff over here. Okay, here was where Babylon was. Alexander the Great conquers all of this. And the Seleucids were at first over like where Persia was. And the Ptolemies were in Egypt. But what ends up happening, these other kingdoms essentially fall or shrink or go away. And these two Hellenistic means Greek, like they were Greek empires from Alexander the Great. They end up fighting over Judah. And that's kind of when this book gets written. And so here's a picture of how Antiochus IV kind of spread out the Seleucid Empire, and they come in and they conquer Israel and Jerusalem and Judah over here. That's when they kind of invade the temple. When that happens, some of them rise up, and that leads to that Maccabean or Hasmonean dynasty that conquers back Israel. It's free for a little bit until the Romans come, and then we get Jesus. Okay, that was a lot of history. So I just remember it's set here in Babylon and during this Medo-Persian Empire, but it's not written until down here when the Hellenistic or the Greeks have come and conquered Israel. And Daniel has those two phases, even the different languages that kind of reflect that. Cool. You're like, I love it. All right.
What is Persia today?
Persia is like modern day Iran and Iraq.
Iran?
Yeah, I think. Is it Iran? Okay. I think Iraq is Babylon. And I think in Afghanistan, too, I think is... Okay, that's the history. It's set back in the exile, but it's not written until way later. There's a lot of... If you have questions after class, you can ask me why we think that. But there's a few people I want you to hold on to and remember. The most important is obviously Daniel. There are some mentions of a Daniel in other parts of the Bible. That is probably not this Daniel. The way I want you to think of Daniel, Daniel represents anyone, any Jew living in exile, trying to follow living God in a foreign place. It's about having integrity in the empire, integrity when you're out in a foreign land. Daniel is that first part. A lot of scholars think it's a compilation of stories, like it wasn't a particular person. It may have been all of these stories of people that were resisting the empire while they were living in exile. And Daniel comes to represent all of that. He may also have been someone living in the court, and they told all these other stories around him. But he is like the hero figure for how do I live and follow God in a world that doesn't. Very similar to the book of Revelation when we talked about it. Remember Daniel, and remember that you can be Daniel, and you're called to be like Daniel. We are also called to have integrity in the empire. The other person to hold on to is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a Babylonian king. When he was king, he was the most powerful person in all of the world. He had it all. We're going to see what it was like for him when he had it all as we go over the next few weeks. Nebuchadnezzar, though, represents any evil king or any evil empire. So Daniel, someone of God, following God. Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, any evil kingdom, any evil king. When I think of Daniel, I think about Nebuchadnezzar. I used to breed goldfish because I was weird. We had like 7 different tanks in our house, and I don't know why Rachel let me do this. But this was our fish named Nebuchadnezzar. And he was called Nebuchadnezzar because he had this funny hat on top. These are called Aranda goldfish. I'd have to do surgery on this dude's like eyes to get this stuff off of it because it would grow over his eyes and we'd have to trim it back. And one day I was doing a water change and his poor little head got stuck in the suction and he didn't make it. It was very sad. When I think of Nebuchadnezzar, I think about this fish. I don't want you to think about a fish when you think of Nebuchadnezzar. I want you to think about, this is the Sith Lord from Star Wars. I was trying to think of like what y'all would think of as like an evil king or emperor, and I thought Star Wars for some reason. I want you to think about whoever the most evil emperor, reigny person is for you. That's who Nebuchadnezzar is. And I want you to think about that because Nebuchadnezzar is powerful and evil, but also, even though he was powerful and evil, God gave him a chance. And so did Daniel. And we'll see how that unfolds too. There's a few other characters to hold on to. Some of them is the magicians or the wise men. You're going to hear me talk a lot about wisdom, or those at court that were wise men, or I might even say the magi. Remember the magi that came to see Jesus? They came from the east. That would be like from Babylon, where Daniel is. Daniel was pulled out of Jerusalem. The way Babylon would conquer nations is they would take the elite, those who were educated or wealthy, who had already been trained up, and they would bring them back to court to run the empire for them. Sometimes they would be eunuchs, sometimes they wouldn't be, but they would take anyone who was experienced and educated. They were the wise men, or like the magi. But we're going to see how Daniel did that job faithfully, but did it different than other wise men or magi. When we get to the fiery furnace, there's this fourth guy in the fire. So hold on to that. We'll see that next week. There's also King Cyrus. We talked about him already. He was the Persian king. So there is other kings and officials. You can ignore all of their names. Just remember Nebuchadnezzar and remember Cyrus. And also Daniel's friends, whose, don't look at this. I can't cover that side. But what are Daniel's friends' names? Yeah. I don't know why this is. We all say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So that was their Babylonian names. We'll get to that in a moment. They were renamed, but their Hebrew names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And in the text, it doesn't call them by their Babylonian names. It uses their Hebrew names. But for some reason, we remember Daniel as Daniel and the others as their Babylonian name. And I don't know why that is. I'm like that too. I can't remember their real names. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, maybe by the end of this, we'll know them as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And if those names sound funny, so does Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? We're just used to saying it. There's also this guy. This is the Son of Man, or we'll get to him later in the apocalyptic visions. When I talk about it, I'll talk about this as being Jesus. And then there's this statue, and we'll dissect that today. But Nebuchadnezzar has this dream about a statue of metal. And there's all these different metals. And if you were like me growing up, we had that statue on the wall, and we knew what every one of those metals meant and what kingdom it was and which one we were living in now. And we in my family interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream as like an actual timeline for history. Because we were cool. All right. That's who you should know. Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, also his friends. Also remember the magicians or the wise men or the magi. And then maybe the fourth man in the fire. Later we'll get to the Son of Man. This figure will be there in a few weeks. This is what I wanted to... Let me check my notes. I don't have anything else extra. So like I said before, a lot of scholars think this was a composite work. So it developed over centuries. The first part, the court tales, or the stories of hope in the court, a lot of scholars today will think that was originally chapters 2 through 6. Those were written in Aramaic. That would have been the common tongue there in Babylon, at least for like international trade when you're dealing with Judah and things like that. It's a very close and similar language to Hebrew, but it was more common. People spoke Aramaic than Hebrew if you were not just a Jew. I'm going to get a sip of coffee. And a lot of scholars will think that those stories probably floated around for centuries. So they would have floated way back from the exile, and they took those stories with them, even though Daniel doesn't get written down until later. Then when they're living during that Seleucid, when the Seleucid Empire, when Antiochus IV is written, they would have added to it. Oh, I'm a slide ahead of myself. Sorry, ignore what I'm saying. So this genre, this includes narrative, and it also includes apocalyptic visions. The narrative is what we'll look at this week and next week. It's the court tales next week. Or after that, we'll look at the apocalyptic stuff. And the theology of this book is that God has sovereignty over empires. And so, just like in Revelation, no one is more powerful than God. Remember we said, not Caesar is Lord, Jesus is Lord. It's a very similar look. God is more powerful than any empire. That we can have hope despite being in persecution, and how to have fidelity or integrity when you're living in exile. Okay. Oh, I have one more part I was going to say. Daniel is a living tell or book. And so that means that this is always relevant. It's always been adapted, and it can always be re-understood. So like I said before, the story of Daniel represents like the ideal Jew or the ideal person following God, no matter where they live. And that because of that, the story changed. And so when the Jews were finding themselves living in exile in Egypt, they added to the story of Daniel to make that story their own. And we should do that too. Like we should let this story live and breathe and help us also live with integrity. Does that make sense there? Okay. I'm going to really quickly go through this part. When Daniel was originally written, it was probably chapters 2 through 6 in Aramaic. Those were the compilation of stories that had been passed down, and some Jewish scholars would have written them down and put them together. At the end of that period, some scholars think that they added chapter 1 and chapter 7 to the book, kind of as like an introduction and a conclusion. In the second period, so this is when the Seleucids or the Greeks are reigning over Israel and the rest is written, they add chapters 8 through 12, except now it's written in Hebrew. The reason it was written in Hebrew and not Aramaic is because when the Greeks came over, they were trying to Hellenize the culture. They were trying to erase that Hebrew identity. And so the book is written in Hebrew to kind of reclaim that Hebrew identity. We're not like the others. We're Jews. We're Hebrews. And so it's written in Hebrew. And then they maybe would have added or translated chapter 1 into Hebrew to kind of give symmetry to the book. It gives it some structure. There's also a lot of edits that get made throughout the book. And so, like, for instance, there's a timeline that's given, and we'll say timeline loosely, in the visions that Daniel has, and it gets changed 2 times. There's a couple other times, even today, where some of the details of the story just kind of change. And that's just because it's a living tale. It was a compilation. It grew over time. And sometimes little parts get inserted in. Just like our Gospels, sometimes stories get thrown in there that weren't originally written, and it kind of messes up the flow of the story. Daniel does that too. And then there was some Greek additions. And so when they were living in Egypt, after chapter 3, there's 2 additions, and like we said before, chapter 13 and chapter 14 get added. One thing that's unique about the Greek editions is that they are a lot kinder to foreign kings. And one of the reasons may have been when the story was originally written back in Babylon, and the stories come from there, the kings were not nice to Jews. But when they were living in Egypt, they might have been. And so they were a little more friendly because in their context, they didn't need to be as harsh. Does that make sense? Are you so interested? Okay, we're almost done with this. We're about to watch a video in a moment. Here is our outline for the book. Chapter 1 is Daniel and his friends in Nebuchadnezzar's court. We will use this outline when we go through the book. So you'll notice on your handout in bold, it says chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar and his friends, or Daniel and his friends in Nebuchadnezzar's court. Chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the 4 kingdoms. Chapter 3 is going to be about the statue in the fiery furnace. It's different than this dream of the statue. He builds a statue. That is when these 2 Greek additions get added. So there's the prayer of Azariah and also the song of the 3 Jews. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is going to have another dream, and he's going to become mad like a beast. Chapter 5 is going to be Nebuchadnezzar's son ruling in his place. And there's this writing on the wall that foretells how the kingdom of Babylon will fall. The next day, Persia takes over. And interestingly, Babylon wasn't really conquered. They just took over. Like, it wasn't really a big war that they slowly took territory. It just changed hands of whoever ruled that day. Chapter 6 will be Darius's decree, and that's when the lion's den is going to happen. And I love the lion's den. It's a good story. After that is going to be all of the visions, and we'll get to there when we get to there. Now, wait, let me ask. Any questions on that outline? Yeah.
I keep thinking, referencing the Jews' exile to Babylon, that psalm the heart-rending psalm. I think it's 137 about we're weeping under the willows and we hung up our harps because let us never forget Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And, the notes say that's written at this, I think it's at the same time, right, during the exile. When you go into, sort of like pop quiz, when you go into this later, are there other psalms that were written at that time? Were all the psalms written in Hebrew, this whole language thing?
Oh, these are good questions.
So, are there other parts of the Bible that reference their exile in Babylon?
Pretty much everything in the Old Testament, yeah. So the way the story of Israel is they were primarily those who worship in the temple. They had priests, they had lots of rituals, they did sacrifices. During the exile, it changed everything because there was no temple to go to. And so the religion of Judaism really shifts during the exile, which only happens in 2 generations, but they become a text-based religion more so. And so it wasn't until the exile that the Old Testament as we know it gets put together. That happens in the exile and primarily when they come back from exile. And so some of the stories are old and come from before then. But for instance, the first 5 books of the Bible, they're not written until Israel comes back out of exile. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those. But there are older ones. So the Psalms, there is 5 books of the Psalms. Book 1 and 2 come from before the exile. Those are typically what we call Davidic Psalms. I think it's book 3 and 4 are the ones primarily written in the exile and when they come back. And book 5 is like a future vision. What's cool about the Psalms, though, as a whole, they tell the story of Israel. And so book 1 and 2 is remembering way back when they had the temple. 3 and 4 are the sad Psalms because they have lost the beauty, they've lost their land, they've lost the place they love. And then book 5 is this messianic hope of looking out to the future. That was a great question. I'm not sure about the language part. I think most of them are in Hebrew. And there's also extra psalms that didn't make it into the Psalter because people number psalms differently, and people always wrote psalms. Those were just kind of the most popular ones. Okay. When I was looking for some videos to help tell the story of Daniel, I had a lot of trouble, but I found this new group that wants to make an animated series for kids that's actually well done, like a TV show. And so they put a promo out, and they have finished the first 4 episodes, but they ran out of money, and they haven't published it. And it took me a long time to find it because I kept trying to look. But we're only going to play a few minutes of this because it's just the preview, and then they're going to talk about the project. But this is a really good introduction, I think. I really enjoyed it. I watched it a few times. I found this, I think, early this week. Where's my mouse? Here we go. Oop. My sound's not coming the right way. I think someone should invent a way to look at your screen. I guess it's because I don't duplicate my screen. It's so confusing to look at both of these. Okay, here we go.
In 605 BC, a rising young ruler swept across all of the modern-day Middle East, overwhelming every nation in his path with the force of his formidable army. His goal is to revive the legacy of his ancestors by establishing the most powerful kingdom the world had ever seen. Attack! He was a warrior. No man could stand against him. Where'd he go? And he showed no mercy. His name was King Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sorry.
Of all the times to mispronounce my name, you gonna do it during my intro?
I'm sorry.
I can't believe
I
it.
said I'm sorry, all right? You know what? We're just gonna give you a nickname.
Huh?
Anyway, During this unprecedented military campaign by the one whom we will now refer to as King Nebi, he invaded Israel and took young nobles captive to be trained to serve in Babylon's palace, all of whom were handpicked by his most trusted officer. However, one of these exiles would prophesy the downfall of the very kingdom that took them captive and the rise of another unlike any other.
That's all there is, and there's no more to show you. I'm so sorry. I know you all probably loved it as much as I did. I thought that was a good way of looking at it, and one thing I love about not only art but just kids' videos is they just help bring the story to life in new ways. I could not find my mouse. I see it here. It just doesn't want to come here. There it is. Wow. It doesn't want to come to my computer. Here it is. Okay. Okay, that is an overview of Daniel. There's your fun little animated preview. Let's go ahead and begin with chapter 1. Daniel and his friends in Nebuchadnezzar's court. To me, the story that stands out in here is the part about him refusing to eat the food. And so I found this fun little meme. The first and last time teenage boys refuse food. I thought that was funny. So this begins in the first 2 verses. It sets us up the history when Nebuchadnezzar is king, what they do. But King Nebi, or Nebuchadnezzar, conquers Judah. He conquers Jerusalem. The way that they would do that is they would conquer the land, like it said in the video, and I said before, they would take out those who were well-educated, or who were wealthy, or who had connections. They did that so that the cities couldn't build themselves back up, because there was no ruling class, but also because, hey, free labor, people already trained that can rule your own kingdom. And so they get taken away. They are taken out to Babylon. In my text, it says Shinar, which made me think about Lord of the Rings and the hobbits in this like glorious land. I don't know if anyone is, no, okay, all right. So, but Shinar is the name for the city of Babylon. It's usually the bad name for it, though. And so it's already setting up in this book that this is a bad place. They've gone away to a bad place. One thing I want to just make note of is the word delivered. They did not conquer Israel or Judah or Jerusalem. God delivered Judah to Babylon. And so we've already set the power context. They did not conquer this kingdom because Babylon's gods are stronger than Israel or Judah's God. God gave them over. And if you look at other texts in the Hebrew Bible, it's because they sinned. And so God was letting kind of punishment come to them. Like they set up in the covenant way back in the book of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. After this, we see how they're going to be re-educated. The picture I had is like someone being hypnotized. And so it starts off with these wise men. And I just want to draw your attention back to this word of wisdom. They were looking for wise men or like magi to help rule in the court. And so they find Daniel and his 3 friends. What are their names? I can't remember their Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they go there. When they're there, they're going to give them royal food and the wine that's there. We'll see how Daniel kind of responds to that in a moment. And they're going to be trained up for a number of years so that they can be the court officials. The other thing that's happening here is that they get renamed. So Daniel becomes renamed to Belshazzar. Hananiah is renamed to Shadrach. Mishael is renamed to Meshach. And Azariah is renamed to Abednego. If you're into the meaning of names, this is what their Hebrew names meant, and then I'll tell you what their new names, their Babylonian names are. Daniel meant God is my judge. Belshazzar is Bel is my judge, or Bel is my prince. Bel would be the Babylonian god. Hananiah meant Jehovah is gracious. Shadrach is the command of Aku, who was the moon god in Babylon. Mishael is who is what God is, but he was renamed to who is like Shak, which was the god of Venus, or another Babylonian god. Azariah meant Jehovah has helped. He was renamed to Abednego, which meant servant of Nebo. When you know the names, it really kind of sets the meaning. They were taken, like their whole identity was changed. Their names that were connected to Yahweh and to Israel's gods get flipped, and now they belong to Babylonian gods. It's really sad. It's this way of assimilation. They don't even get their own names. They can't even keep their own god. They are completely changed who they are. We will talk about this in a few minutes, but this is a way of them having like a non-violent protest when they go throughout. We'll see it in the next slide. They're going to refuse to eat the food of the king. They're also, in the book, never going to be referred to their Babylonian names. They will only be called by their Hebrew names. And it's this way of engaging in a non-violent protest or resistance. They say, we will not take part of this empire. I really love Daniel 1:8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself. And it goes on with how he's not going to do that. With the royal rations of food and wine. So he asked the palace master to allow him to not defile himself. I love that line, though. Daniel resolved not to defile himself. For me, that's like the key verse to the whole book. And so I put that at the bottom of our little summary sheet for Daniel. It's there in the PowerPoint. It was there. So he resolves not to defile himself. For 10 days, he's only going to have water and veggies. And then they're going to compare who is the strongest. I'll just make a note. He is not refusing to eat the food because it wasn't kosher. He's refusing to eat that food because it came from the kingdom. It came from the empire. It was the king's food. It's not that it wasn't kosher. He's going way above and beyond what would have been expected. He's just saying, I won't even eat the food of the king. I will eat like the commoners, like everyone else, like how I ate growing up. Does that make sense there? I was going to ask you to have this discussion question, but we're not going to due to time. So you can think about it, and you can all call each other this evening and talk about it. But Daniel's refusal to eat the food of the king or use Babylonian names are subtle examples of nonviolent protests of the empire. What ways can we do the same to systems of evil around us? How can we resist or protest these things that take away our identity or ask us to not live the way that we find God has called us to live? A good question to think about, and Daniel's a really great example to follow. At the end of chapter 1, we're going to see what happens. So they compare Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. I think that's their names. It's really a struggle for me to not say Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But they're going to compare them, and there is no one as strong or beautiful and everything as Daniel and his friends. And so, why do I have 10 times? I put that in there to say something. I don't remember why. Oh, that's it. Because they were 10 times better than all the other magicians and wise men that were already in the court. And as a note, in the story, they are young men, but they're like as wise as like the oldest scholar or something like that. And so they were filled with this wisdom. What we're going to come to find out, and it's one of the things we see throughout the biblical text, the way God works. I've said this line before, but God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the called. And so God called this young man to be a man of wisdom in the court. And there was no way Daniel, as a young teenager, and his friends could have had that. So it came from God. And it becomes as a point to bear witness to the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, and not the Babylonian gods. Does that make sense there? Any questions on chapter 1? Okay. Chapter 2 is going to get us to Nebuchadnezzar's dream. He's going to have a dream of 4 kingdoms. I'm realizing right now that I have the wrong picture. It's still, I guess, like the part about food when I made my PowerPoint. The first chapter, in the first 13 verses, or the second chapter, we're going to learn about Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which we'll just say he has a really interesting dream. He has this dream that haunts him, and we don't know what the dream is yet. And remember, Nebuchadnezzar is the evil emperor king. We're going to see an example of that, because he calls in all of the wise men, the magi, the magicians from the court, to come and tell him what the dream means. But Nebuchadnezzar's like, you know what? I'm not even going to tell you my dream. First, you have to tell me what my dream is. Then you have to tell me what it means. In the ancient world, and I was like this when I was a kid, dreams had meanings. And so you would tell people your dreams, and they would tell you what they meant. Nobody expected anyone to be able to tell you what you dreamed, because that's mind reading. That's not just reading the signs. And so Nebuchadnezzar kind of sets all of the wise men in this trap where there's no way out. Maybe he did this because he thought they were a bunch of yes men that only told him what he wanted to hear. We don't know. What we do know is that he's a bad guy, and he's not a nice guy. And he's about to kill everyone, and that's going to include Daniel, and that's not good. And so what Daniel is going to do is seek wisdom. So the court, the right-hand man for Nebuchadnezzar and the executioner, they warned Daniel that, hey, you're going to be put to death now because all the wise men couldn't do this. And Daniel's like, whoa, hold on. And so Daniel goes, first he figures out the context. I like the way Daniel does this. He figures out the context. He goes and gets supporters, and then they sit down and they pray together. And what a way to do something when a crisis happens. Figure out the context before you freak out, get the support that you need, and then go pray about it. I mean, it's just, you can always follow Daniel's example. Let's see. Was there something else I was going to say here? He doesn't panic. He goes and seeks out more wisdom. And then I was going to ask you this question, but again, due to time, I'm not going to do this question here. We'll do one later. But this was the question for you to think about. Call each other tonight. You can talk about it. Actually, do this one tomorrow, because the first one's about living in the empire. What role do community and friends play in helping Daniel stay faithful? And who are your Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or whatever their Hebrew names are? Friends are important. The other part that I love is this prayer that Daniel gives in chapter 2. And so we are actually going to read it together like a psalm. Can everyone see? Okay. So we're gonna do this prayer like we would do a psalm and read it back and forth. And so I'm gonna be the first line. The one that's underlined is for all of you. And so this is Daniel's prayer. Blessed be the name of God from age to age.
For wisdom and power are his.
He changes times and seasons.
He clothes the kings and sets up kings.
He gives wisdom to the wise.
And knowledge to those who have understanding.
He reveals deep and hidden things.
He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him.
To you, O God of my ancestors,
I give thanks and praise.
For you have given me wisdom and power, and have now revealed to me what we asked of you.
For you have revealed to us what the king ordered.
Whenever you come across a prayer in Scripture or a quote in Scripture, take a moment and pause and read it again. And it's really helpful, for prayers, to treat them like a psalm, just like we do in our psalm, and read it back and forth. The prayers in the Bible are usually poetry. They're not just randomly written there. It's something beautifully crafted to kind of get the point of the whole prayer across. I really like this one. You're blessing God. We bless God because God is more powerful than any other king. And so it's not that Nebuchadnezzar is this all-powerful king reigning over the whole world. Even though for Daniel and his friends, that's what it looked like. Just a few minutes before this, the executioner was coming to take him away. But Daniel doesn't flee. He goes and he prays. He remembers that God is the one who is more powerful. God is the one who gives wisdom. And now, at the end, he knows the message that God has for him. Yeah.
So I got to this part and I wondered why when the prayer book was written, that this didn't make it into the Canticles.
Oh, that's a good.
So many of these prayers, their poetry are Canticles. The Song of Isaiah is Old Testament,
Yeah.
right? The Magnificat, the Song of Simeon. And, you might have to cut off the part about the king, like that probably wouldn't really work. but the first part, especially if you
Oh, maybe
start
that's
with-
why, because it was the Church of England.
Yeah. But if you get to the part, I give thanks and praise. It's like you said, it's beautiful poetry.
It is,
Beautiful
yeah.
song of praise.
Also, the Greek edition, the Song of Azariah, is in our prayer book, and I think it's morning prayer. If there's any morning prayer nerds, mine's in my backpack, which is upstairs. But yeah, these moments they end up in our prayer book a lot. But here's one to hold on to. It's very beautiful. Let's see. Daniel then goes before the king. And here's the things that really stood out to me. The first thing, he was quite brave. It's I don't know if it's just me. I'm not really I don't like conflict. I'm kind of conflict averse. But if I'm about to be killed by a big king, I'm going to be like, oh, king, you're so smart. And Daniel just calls it out like it is. He is very brave and he's very honest. So the first thing is he goes and seeks out. He goes to the king, which again is crazy. If someone's coming to kill me, I don't go towards that person. I go the other direction. Not that that's ever happened to me, but that's what I imagine I would do. Or I would break down and cry. But Daniel doesn't because he's brave and he's honest. He goes and he speaks truth to power like a prophet would do. The other thing that he does is he always gives the praise to God. And so he talks about his own wisdom, and he says, it's not mine, it's God's wisdom that God gave me. If you were reading this and that sounded familiar to you, hold on to that thought, because I'll ask you about that again in a second. But first, we're going to talk about Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So Nebuchadnezzar has this dream about this big statue. There is a head of gold, a chest of silver. I think it says thighs of bronze, legs of silver, and then the toes, or not the toes, the feet are made of a mixture of iron and of clay. Makes sense, right? Everyone knows what that means. Not really. Neither did Nebuchadnezzar, so he was all confused. And so Daniel comes and interprets it. Oh, sorry, I left out a part. There's the statue, but then there's this really big rock that slams into it and makes a mountain and stuff. That rock's important. Woohoo! Are y'all ready to break down the dream? I know you're so excited. You remember how I showed you that map earlier? Now you're going to go, oh, I'm so glad I paid attention then, because now I know what it means. So the gold is going to represent Babylon. The silver is going to represent the Medes. You may have a commentary that mixes the Medes and the Persians, but we're going to stick to this one for here. The bronze represents the Persians, and then the iron is going to represent the Greeks. And if you remember that the Greeks were divided into two empires, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, that's why there's two different legs, because they were kind of at a civil war. And then after that, like the feet, the other Greek kingdoms all get divided into these smaller kingdoms. And so what we see here is this succession of power for when this book was written. So if you were them and you were a Jew, and you think about the big, bad, scary empires that you've had to go through in recent memory, there was Babylon, and we thought they were the most powerful kingdom. But then the Medes came and they conquered Persia, and then the Persians came and conquered Babylon, and then the Greeks came and they conquered the whole known world. But then they all fell apart and they started fighting each other. And so it's this dream that's a succession of all of these empires that have already existed. But something else happens. We've seen like the kingdoms are getting more powerful and more powerful and more powerful. But then this rock comes and slams and knocks the statue down. And that rock is God. It's God's kingdom that's going to come and lay waste all these other ones. From Nebuchadnezzar's perspective, this dream is horrifying because for him, it's about the loss of his own kingdom, the loss of his own life, the loss of his own power. But for those who read this book, the book of Daniel, that are being conquered every generation and slaughtered and killed, this gives hope. Just like the book of Revelation, that these kingdoms of the world may look like they are the most powerful thing in the world and that they will conquer us forever, but God's kingdom will come and knock all of them out. And so just like Daniel, don't give in to the empire. Live with integrity in the empire because God is going to act soon. Does that make sense there?
Yeah.
It's a powerful dream. Here's another map. We're not going to look at the more maps. Here was the Medes. The Persians come and conquer the Medes. They come in and conquer Babylon. And then Alexander the Great conquers all of it in Egypt and the whole world. That's what the dream's talking about. We already saw this map before. And this was another discussion question. We're, again, to time, this is just for you to think about. Talk to each other about it Sunday morning. The stone that was not cut by human hands represents God's kingdom. How is that kingdom, God's kingdom, breaking into our world now? And how do we live into that reality? That was the question to think about. We asked similar questions in Revelation, but throughout the whole biblical text, in particular these books, we get that idea that God's kingdom is bleeding through into this world. It's in one sense already here, but it's not fully realized. And our job is like to help pull it all the way through the rest of the way. And so it's a good way of thinking about your life and where you tie into that. Finishing up chapter 2, Daniel is going, and his friends will be elevated. So they end up kind of as the top of the court because Daniel, unlike the others, could tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was and what it meant. And that way, Nebuchadnezzar knew it was true. There's some interesting moments in here, but they end up worshiping the God of Israel. Or Nebuchadnezzar at least recognizes that Daniel's God, the God of Israel, is a more powerful God than his God.
The Hebrews have seen parallels to the story of Joseph's elevation.
Yes. Okay, so, and you'll see that right here. So Daniel, like Joseph, is elevated. And that was when you were reading the dream before, and you go, some of this sounds familiar, like Joseph. This picture is actually Joseph going before the Pharaoh of Egypt. Remember how we talked about Daniel being a living tale that kind of gets retold and reimagined? Daniel also retells a lot of other Jewish stories and Babylonian stories that were older, but it puts it in a Jewish context. And one of those is with this dream. And so you may remember Joseph back in the book of Genesis. They're living almost like in exile, but they're living in Egypt. Joseph is sold into slavery. He is also about to be killed. He is a dream interpreter. He is a wise man, and he is elevated to reign and rule over the court. For all Jews living in exile, they both serve as examples of how do I live in a foreign land, and it's be the best and give the glory to God. That's kind of the example. So yeah, it literally is just Joseph's story that's retold. So good job if it was familiar. Any questions on those two chapters? We're about to watch the Bible Project video. Do you like Daniel so far?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Okay, me too. I love Daniel. And again, I'm just going to hold on to Daniel's a great example of integrity. And so, if Daniel does it, you should probably do it too. Oh, I just realized I forgot to print out the Bible Project chart. I will have that next week. I didn't even think about printing it.
The story is set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken away the Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this 2-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12, it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and that puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. So the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power. And so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these 2 stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a god, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so, like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts, and like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire. And it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament. And there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The 3 stories of faithfulness despite persecution. These are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final 3 visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final 2 beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is an image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people in his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms: Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now, the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that, in a sense, they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus' empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
I hope you come to fall in love with Daniel over the next coming weeks. It's a good book to fall in love with. And if you remember, what is Daniel about? Integrity in the empire. The Lord be with you. My God, we pray that you would make us a people of integrity who follow you, who have hope no matter where we are in the world or what life throws at us. Amen.
Alexander, who's the author of the Daniel, A Theological Introduction to African Americans?